Folks, welcome back to another episode of the I Am GPH podcast. And today we're going to welcome you deep into the world of bioethics and a little bit of philosophy. Today we have Dr. Daniel Fogal, who's an assistant professor of bioethics here at NYU GPH. He's also a faculty advisor for bioethics minors out here. He has done a BA in San Luis Obispo in California and has also achieved a PhD here at NYU and is now teaching over here. He specializes in bioethics, metaethics, epistemology, and philosophy of language, and has been a part of numerous publications which you can find on our website. We can't wait to learn more about his journey and mainly about the world of bioethics. Daniel Fogal, welcome to the I Am GPH podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I have to get started on this term bioethics. You seem to be the professional, and I don't even know where to start with it. Someone asked me what bioethics is. Where do I go with this? So can you explain, how would you describe the word bioethics? What does it even mean?
Bioethics is one of those words that has multiple meanings, right? There's kind of narrower and broader conceptions of bioethics. So I personally operate with a kind of broad conception of bioethics. So it'll be kind of any ethical issue, issue having to do with right, wrong, good or bad, having to do with science, medicine, or technology. So in some ways it should be kind of like bio and or tech ethics. Traditionally bioethics focused on issues having to do with, doctor-patient relationship, with research ethics. Over the decades it's kind of evolved where ethical issues related to the environment or animals have also become front and center. Also issues having to do with health at a kind of more population level and global health. Those are also central questions in bioethics. The allocation of scarce medical resources, whether it's local or whether it's global, is a really kind of important one. But I think more recently, kind of bioethics as a field is kind of, because it's always been interested in ethical issues that arise with new technologies, for example, in medicine, it's natural to also be thinking about ethical issues as they arise with, technology more generally. And so lately, of course, it's the rise of the internet, social media, now AI, kind of front and center of concern, both with the public in general and, professionals in particular.
Okay, so let's go to the very beginning for you. Since you've actually summarized it into like what it is really about. How did you first get introduced to this world? What was your first glimpse into the world of bioethics?
Yeah, my route is non-standard. I mean, I grew up, in a kind of conservative area where, I was gripped by a lot of kind of ethical issues, controversial issues, ones having to do with abortion or with physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, with, death penalty. So from an early age, I remember kind of at the dinner table, talking about these things or them just kind of being in the air. And so I was always gripped by ethical issues early on, but it was a kind of more general interest. And, when I went to do a PhD in philosophy, my focus at the time wasn't in applied ethics. So it turned out that the way my kind of professional interest got ignited was through serving as a teaching assistant for Matthew Liao. So he's director of the Center for Bioethics. It used to be part of the philosophy department. So I was a PhD student in the philosophy department. And I had a couple kids in grad school. I got married, illegally young at 22. And so, I needed some extra money, and this was a neat opportunity. And so I TA'd originally for a few of his classes. And that was my kind of gateway into bioethics. I kind of got really interested in it. Did a postdoc in Sweden, not really in bioethics, but my interest had been kind of ignited, as I said. And then I was hired back, kind of boomeranged back to NYU at the Center for Bioethics. By that time, it had migrated from the philosophy department to the then college, now School of Global Public Health. And so then that's what I've been doing for the past 8 or 9 years.
You started by experiencing issues in the environment you grew up in. And then after that, it just unlocked like, okay, I can think about this and there's a demand here or there's a need here. And then the marriage thing also came in early for you where like, okay, I needed an opportunity. This is where my interest lied. And you just dove deep into the world?
Yeah, and it's one of those things where at least, so I've always had broad interests, in general, but also specifically within philosophy. So it's really kind of easy, so to speak, to get me interested in something. And I think a lot of our interests develop somewhat contingently. And so that just happened to be the case. And then once you develop that initial interest and you have some kind of opportunity or, extra reason to kind of pursue it at greater length, you kind of fall properly in love with it. And I should say, like, I care about bioethics at the level of research, but I really care about it at the level of teaching. I think teaching bioethics is the best. I mean, these applied controversial ethical issues that are of just like obvious interest and relevance to pretty much anyone, any thinking person, any living, breathing being on Earth. And so my job is to just get to teach these things. And if it's not controversial, I won't teach it. And I don't tell the students what I think. I don't think that matters. What I care about is helping them think more kind of clearly, more carefully, more critically about these issues that concern us all. So yeah, my passion is really kind of in the classroom in teaching bioethics. I think it's the sweet spot.
Where does this love come from? Like this deep love for bioethics?
I should say between undergrad and grad school, I spent a few years teaching at some private schools. I was a philosophy undergrad degree, unemployable, no special skill set. And I'd already gotten married, and my wife wanted to go to grad school, so she got her master's in social work. And so we both wanted to go to grad school, but I was the one who's going to work while she went to grad school. Then we switched. Mine took longer. But I taught, and I say this just because at the time it was something of convenience, but I was teaching middle school and high school, mostly math, and I loved it. This kind of revealed something. I was like, oh, if I enjoyed teaching, math to middle schoolers, I'm going to enjoy teaching pretty much anything to pretty much anyone. So that was kind of confirming that the classroom was kind of where I belonged, at least in part. And then it was kind of my interest in philosophy that made it sense to, hey, if you can pursue philosophy and then teach it, that's extra good. And if I could teach bioethics, the most relevant bit of philosophy, that's really perfection, or close to it, as close as you can get.
Yeah, the interest, and then there was an ability to teach, and it just naturally culminated together and this formed for you. Curious to know how you ended up at NYU. What was the journey to come here?
So is that for grad school or for as employment?
Let's talk about both, yeah.
I went to Cal Poly not to do philosophy. I was interested in architecture, urban planning, and I was a long distance runner. By the end of my freshman year, I was doing neither, and I had this kind of existential crisis, like, why am I here? Why didn't I go somewhere else? But it turned out Cal Poly was a great place to study philosophy. The reason I had switched to it was just because I had to take a philosophy course. And at Cal Poly, they required everybody at the time to do that, and I just kind of fell for it. So it's Professor Walker's fault that I got into philosophy. And then, I knew that I wanted to basically be like him and do what he did, and that required me going to grad school. And then I had some extra time between undergrad and grad, which is good for me because PhD admissions are just very, very competitive. So I had this time to kind of like work on a writing sample, study for the jury, do the things I needed to be really competitive. And then I was lucky to get admitted. NYU's philosophy department is, a kind of top-ranked program, and it was kind of a dream school of mine. And so that once I got in there, is a fairly easy decision to come to NYU for grad school. And it was kind of attractive to the possibility of living in New York. I think a lot of people have that attraction, for what it has to offer, both kind of professionally, broadly speaking, and in terms of just personal fun.
New York, a philosophy department, amazing place. And then how did it lead into employment for you? What changed?
So I went to got a choice of different postdocs, multi-year postdocs. I took one in Sweden. My wife and I like to say it was the best 2 years of our lives. We're not really joking when we say that. We loved it there. But then a position became available back here at the Center for Bioethics. So when it migrated from the philosophy department to public health, they wanted to grow. They wanted to start a minor in bioethics. At the time, it was just a terminal master's program. And so there was a job opening specifically to help design and implement a minor in bioethics. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to get that position, build that program, and then here I am.
What has that been like before? I wanted to learn about the classes you teach as well, but what has it been like, just kind of new department, you're kind of forming curriculum and deciding what a future generation gets to learn? What does that feel like?
It looks like a lot of work, and it feels like a lot of work, but rewarding work. And so it was a little bit tricky because I did have a real interest in bioethics, but the bulk of my doctoral studies and research and postdoctoral research wasn't squarely bioethical. And so it involved learning about a lot of things I didn't know a lot about, but at the level of kind of program development, you don't need to know all the details of all the topics to kind of have a good sense as to, okay, these are the types of courses we should offer. And And, this is roughly how it should be structured. And you can always make changes later, add more courses or modify existing courses. And so, yeah, it was a kind of a big lift, but it was, I thought just immediately successful. There's a real demand at NYU that for these sorts of courses, they weren't being offered. And so that was an opportunity that was really valuable to step into.
How lovely. I can tell you're so passionate and you enjoy what you do. So I have to learn about the class you're teaching. Can you tell us about the class? What is it all about?
So the class that I was asked to talk about was it's a graduate course. So I should say now I'm teaching both undergrad and grad courses, and so this is a new course I've developed. Second time I'm teaching it, Advanced Introduction to the Ethics of Technology. So I said I have a kind of almost objectionably broad conception of bioethics, where it includes also the ethics of emerging technologies, and so this course is the kind of embodiment of that. And, you can teach a course like this in multiple ways. One way, if it's a kind of this, intro course, advanced intro course, you can pick like a handful of topics, 3 or 4 topics and go do deep dives, spend 3 or 4 weeks on each topic. That's one way to go. Perfectly fine way to go. Another way to go is the kind of what I call the salad bar approach, where you gotta do a kind of quick dive with respect to a wide range of topics, like you might eat at a salad bar. I personally prefer like lots of little bits on my plate rather than just like a slab of meat. I'm a vegetarian, so but nonetheless, like I prefer that in kind of my dinner. I also prefer that teaching. So there's a wide range of topics, and I actually have this up because I can't remember them all. So for the course. Here are the list of topics that we cover. So we start off with the kind of impact of technology on communication. Some people might know this classic work by Neil Postman, who used to be at NYU, Amusing Ourselves to Death. We talk about social media addiction. We talk about the ethics of the kind of attention economy, privacy in the digital age, conspiracy theories, echo chambers, kind of misinformation, where that includes kind of questions about when to defer to experts versus when to kind of trust your own judgment, or so to speak, do your own research, gamification, and I'll be quick, algorithmic bias, AI governance, curiosity, meaning generative AI in the age of generative AI. And then we kind of conclude with kind of foundational questions about AI, consciousness, and welfare. So we cover all of that, right? It's a salad bar approach. We get a week or 2 on each topic. And the idea is to just kind of expose students to the kind of wide range of different issues that arise at the intersection of ethics and technology. And then, they're then able to then, of course, read more, think more, write more about whatever particular topic they might be most interested in.
What made you choose these specific areas? Are these the ones that have been coming up in the world?
Yeah, I think a lot of them are. So, because there's so many other ones I could have touched on. So some of it I think these are just the most important ones. Some of them I think are just the ones that I personally, I'm in charge. So I get to build a syllabus. I get to teach what I want to teach. And there's some things I just really enjoy teaching. But I am generally driven by what I think are the kind of right mix of relevance and importance to, students individually. That can be at like social media addiction or, at the kind of societal level.
Very, very deep topics.
Yeah.
I mean, even I was thinking about like, oh man, there's so much I can even see in that opening up. Everyone's on social media. Everyone's on what's next, our attention economy, what's going on.
And I should say, I mean, one thing this kind of circles back to the question of bioethics and then how I design my courses. So in bioethics, a lot of bioethics is very applied. You focus on one particular topic or case study, and then you focus on it, and that's fine. Our program has a kind of what we call more philosophical orientation. We're all philosophers, and one of the things that distinguishes kind of philosophical bioethics from just kind of straight up applied work is sensitivity to the kind of foundational issues. And so in a course like this, when we talk about, for example, social media addiction, the way it works is I'm like, forget about social media. Let's just talk about addiction, right? Drug addiction or substance abuse disorder. Let's talk about it, the kind of paradigm case. And then we talk about social media addiction, the ways in which it's similar to or maybe different from, the paradigm case. Or if you care about, privacy in the digital age. It's like, cool, forget about the digital age. Let's just talk about privacy. Nice. What is the interest that the right to privacy protects? What does it take to secure that interest? How might the right to privacy be violated, et cetera, et cetera? And then we okay, now let's talk about, privacy in the digital age. And so it's I'm very much concerned with the applied topic, but I want to think about it in a way that's informed by foundational issues or general theories, and I think that's going to be the way to think most clearly, most carefully about the phenomenon.
It's almost like we're at this critical moment in the world of ethics of technology. Then what makes ethics of technology so important for public health students to learn about?
Great question. I mean, one, public health students are just people, and we live in this world where technology is everywhere and affects everything, and so that's one reason, just because you're a person. But specifically with public health, I think it's even more obvious now with AI going everywhere. So any ethical issue with AI, insofar as AI is going to be involved or connected to public health, which it is and will continue to only increasingly be so, any issue in ethical, with AI ethics is going to kind of be relevant. But I think there's other ones. So like just randomly, today we had a guest speaker in one of my courses talking about ethics of autonomous vehicles, and not the kind of standard sort of thought where like, oh, how do we design them? What choices do they make if there's a granny crossing the street, and whatever. Those are important questions. This was specifically kind of a public health angle. So the thought is, okay, under reasonable assumptions in the not too distant future, they're where autonomous vehicles are widely available and cost effective, et cetera, right? So maybe this is 5 years, maybe this is 10 years away. Is there a case against driving, standard driving? And it turns out, driving is incredibly dangerous. It's one of the most dangerous things, maybe the most dangerous thing that most of us do on a kind of day-to-day basis. And there are tens of thousands of deaths and even more serious injuries that are caused, by human, mistakes. And so, if we have this technology that's available that is going to be significantly safer, and we have good reason to believe it not only already is, but will become so even more so in the future, there's going to be a really good case for why maybe, it's going to be maybe wrong morally, impermissible for people to ride, at least when, forget about private roads or in nature where there's, you're not putting others at risk of harm. But you think about, why is drunk driving wrong? Because you're imposing risks of serious harm on others in a way that's unjustified. And you might think regular driving might meet those similar standards in the future, and maybe the state is justified, perhaps, in banning regular vehicles in the same way that, there's similar kind of, they make the appeal to vaccine mandates, the rationale behind those, and it turns out there's a very simple, maybe even better case. So it's an interesting paper where, you might not think that their autonomous vehicles is straightforwardly a public health matter, but it turns out it well may be in the not too distant future. So that's just one small example.
Love it.
Another important connection between the content of the course, concerning ethics of technology and public health, concerns classification systems. So something really kind of foundational, right? Classification systems contain the kind of official kind of standard concepts that we use to kind of carve up the world, to understand the world, to understand the phenomenon. And classification systems are kind of this is a kind of quote from one of the people we read in the course, Sitin Wen. Classification systems are the engine under the hood of metrics and data. They're the conceptual foundation. They set the basic blocks in which institutions will think and how people inside those institutions will talk, remember, and justify themselves, right? Because to have a metric, we need data. To get data, we need a kind of classification system. We need to be able to put labels on things and call them certain things. And so the reliance that we have on classification systems is kind of inevitable, neither good nor bad on its own, but being sensitive to it is important. So I think there's just one really nice example that I'm going to kind of read from. This is from Bowker and Starr, Sorting Things Out. It concerns the ICD-10. So this is the International Statistical Classification of Diseases. There's the ICD-11 came out in 2022, but the earlier iteration, it's formulated by the WHO. And it provides standardized codes for disease and injury. This is then used as the basis for worldwide statistics about disease, about accidents, and mortality, about death. And so this is what I thought was really interesting and kind of illustrates kind of underappreciated issue is that it has far finer granularity for accidents typical, for example, of the urban world. So separate categories for, this is a quote, falls from playground equipment, falls from a bed, falls from a chair, falls from a wheelchair, falls from a toilet, falls from other furniture, falls from steps, falls from a ladder, and falls from scaffolding. But it turns out for accidents in the natural world, all you have are falls from a cliff, falls from a tree, and, quote, falls other. And so you see that the classification systems aren't neutral, right? This is kind of this general point that's really important. Technology is not neutral. It's value laden. All sorts of decisions, value, based decisions are made in pursuing and developing and deploying various technologies. That includes the kind of official classification systems that we use in carving up and understanding the world and modeling it and measuring it and generating data and constructing metrics and all that stuff. And so it's just very clear that ICD-10, the kind of classification system, that it embodies in kind of a certain set of interests, of kind of largely urban/Western kind of set of interests, and kind of deprioritizes, non-urban interests. And these are the basic categories from which everything else is kind of built and generated. And it has real world implications for understanding, what's happening and why, for then, trying to intervene and come up with interventions that can kind of make material differences in the world and improving people's health and well-being. So that's just one small example, kind of concrete case study to make the kind of abstract point about classification systems, more concrete.
I feel like my brain is at the gym right now. And it's truly expanding. It's like simplified down to what the core of it is. Let's talk about that at a high level. Is driving dangerous? Yes, yeah. Driving is dangerous. Then we go into deeper situations and more specifics, and then you can holistically understand the world. It seems so, pardon me my word, philosophical.
Yes,
and
exactly.
I'm very interested in this word philosophical. Mm-hmm. It seems like a lot of philosophical tools are being applied to this. How could you simplify philosophical tools maybe? Because I know you have studied philosophy, so there's a lens of that. And I'm interested in that and how it's applying to the terms you mentioned, like misinformation in the world, and how we are exploring that as public health people.
I think when it comes to, philosophy, I'm not going to try to define the thing. I have a PhD in it. But, one of the things that you've kind of, I think, unites a lot of philosophical inquiry is a sensitivity to kind of what I earlier mentioned as foundational issues. So a lot of it's going to be conceptual clarification. We have these really important terms: health, well-being, racial discrimination, just to mention some that are relevant, for example, for public health. And these are really important concepts. Turns out they're really complex, oftentimes multidimensional, perhaps ambiguous in various ways, have multiple meanings. There's hard questions about how to not just understand them, but operationalize them. And these are all, I think, philosophical questions where at the first instance, you're just trying to get clear on the meaning of central terms and concepts, but also on the nature of the phenomenon that they're supposed to represent or that they're supposed to correspond to, because you want the concepts to do a good job, tracking the things that matter, and then you want your kind of operationalizations of those concepts, because we oftentimes have to do that for the purposes of data, acquisition or studies and whatnot. You want those things to be faithful to the phenomenon, and they're always going to involve simplifications. They're always going to involve possible distortions, and keeping an eye out for these things, being aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we might do it better. I think that's one level. I think philosophers are also kind of professional arguers, not in the sense of like let's fight, but in the sense of rationally evaluating arguments, in the sense of like where you have claims, philosophers call them premises, that support other claims, what we call conclusions. And so philosophers are kind of like almost pedantic. They'll take their main arguments and they'll have like, here's premise 1, the first main claim. Here's premise 2, second main claim. Here's the conclusion, right, that's supposed to follow. If you accept these first 2 claims, here's what you're kind of rationally committed to. And then we can see what exactly is doing the argumentative work. We can, if you want to reject the conclusion, then you need to look, okay, which of the premises is problematic, which one should you reject or at least not accept. Does the conclusion in fact follow from the premises? So philosophers are, I think, that's the name of the game in philosophy is generating arguments for important conclusions and then kind of assessing them in a kind of fair-minded way, kind of as fair-minded as possible, and also subjecting them to real scrutiny, right? Questioning hidden assumptions. This premise says whatever. Well, okay, ask a question about it, and pushing the argument kind of one step further, or drawing additional conclusions. And so I think that's a big part of what philosophers do, and it's a kind of transferable skill. You can develop it in certain settings, and then it's general mindset you can apply more generally in thinking, again, more clearly, carefully, kind of philosophically about issues in whatever domain.
You're such a fascinating mind. and I'm almost like someone like you who's so well versed in this area. What made you come to NYU? What's the X factor that NYU offers when it comes to bioethics for you?
For me, originally it was a good job, right? If I were a student who was interested in studying bioethics, for example, whether it's at the undergraduate level or at the master's level, I think one thing that we have going for us is, we do what I've been describing. We do philosophical bioethics unapologetically. And we're one of, if not the only programs that does that, where our courses are thoroughly philosophical. We're talking about applied issues in the real world, but from informed from a kind of sensitivity to foundational issues and assessing kind of carefully arguments for and against. But more generally, I think what's attractive both for me personally, kind of / professionally, and then for prospective students is, it's not just the Center for Bioethics, right? We've got this world-class philosophy department literally across the street. We have great public health professionals. We have top, law school or psych department. So it's the kind of, the Division of Medical Ethics is at Langone. They do, more clinical ethics that kind of complement us. But there's just a wealth of good people and good high quality research and events and workshops that are happening. You get a severe case of FOMO that you have to kind of at least it took me years to kind of overcome it, where you just realize you can't go to all the things, and but that's a good problem to have.
The student watching, there must be someone that is currently enrolled at NYU. There might be someone that is thinking of joining NYU, and there might be someone that's thinking of choosing their next semester classes. What kind of student do you think is ideal for the world of bioethics? What kind of person would you encourage to join not only your class, but indulge in the world of bioethics?
Almost anyone. It's a sort of thing that because these issues are so pressing in bioethics and in ethics of technology in particular, we need as many good people thinking as carefully as possible about these issues, going forward, especially with the rate of change, with technology. And there's just way too many issues happening way too fast or rising way too fast. And so one is that, I just want as many people as possible thinking about these issues kind of carefully or being sensitive to that. But I think if somebody kind of, is already interested in kind of, ethical issues, I think almost everybody is, and they just want to be able to think more carefully about them and have an opportunity, be literally forced to read, to write, to think about these issues more carefully, learn what other people who have thought about these issues at great length have to say about these important issues. I think that's one kind of student. I think it's also the sort of thing that these issues arise now, and they're versions of them are going to re-arise in the future. Technologies, for example, is not going anywhere. So being better prepared to think carefully and act correctly going forward as a professional or as a parent or as an individual. I think all of these things are, you're not going to learn everything in one class, but it's going to be one thing that kind of helps, expose you to a certain set of issues, a certain way of thinking, kind of generate a certain kind of mindset that can be refined and applied kind of going forward. I think almost anybody would benefit, and I think most people would find it quite interesting, the content of the courses.
Well, Dr. Daniel Fogal, I found you very interesting as well, and I wish I could take this class. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of students that think like this and are very open to expanding their mind that applies to every single aspect of the world, are surely going to be taking your class very soon. Thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.
That's Dr. Daniel Fogal, everyone. Links in description to look up Dr. Daniel Fogal and learn more. And we hope to see any bioethics interests, comments down there below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode. Take care.